They had never seen their own faces, until a white man lifted a small black box and held it toward the sun. The wind moved low across the desert floor, carrying the dry scent of sage and dust, brushing against canvas lodges and the quiet circle of men who stood watching. Elias Mercer kept his hand steady, though his pulse tapped hard beneath his ribs. The camera felt heavier than its 3 pounds suggested, as if it understood the weight of what it was about to do. He had traveled nearly 120 miles by horse and wagon to reach this valley, chasing light the way other men chased gold. But light was different here. It did not fall. It settled. It rested on the red earth, on the braids of the elders, on the careful stillness of Chief Tahoma as he stood 10 feet away, shoulders straight, eyes unreadable. Elias had photographed ranchers in Kansas, railroad men in Missouri, children outside church houses in Oklahoma Territory. He had watched faces bloom from blank paper before, yet this felt different. This was not a portrait for a parlor wall. This was a moment that did not yet know it was about to become permanent. "It only takes a second," Elias said quietly, his voice careful, respectful. The interpreter did not translate. He didn't need to. The tribe understood the gesture. They had been watching the box since dawn, since Elias unpacked it from its leather case and set it on a folded wool blanket like something fragile and alive. A few of the younger men shifted closer, curiosity shining in their eyes. They had heard of images that held faces, but rumor and reality were two different things. Chief Tahoma stepped forward without being asked. He did not smile. He did not pose. He simply stood, the sun striking one side of his face, shadow resting along the other. In that balance, Elias saw something steady, authority shaped not by force but by memory. In this place, stories were not written. They were carried. The elders held them the way a man holds a compass. Elias lifted the camera to his eye. The world narrowed to a rectangle. The desert wind paused, or maybe it only felt that way. He pressed the shutter. A sharp click cut through the air. Some of the children flinched. Elias pulled the square sheet from the camera, white and blank, and for a heartbeat it looked like nothing at all. Then he held it out, and slowly, like dawn spreading across open land, an image began to rise from the emptiness. Lines formed first, then shadow, then the outline of Chief Tahoma's face, emerging inch by inch, undeniable and still. A murmur traveled through the circle. The young men leaned forward. One elder stepped back. No one spoke. They were not looking at paper. They were looking at proof. For generations, a man's standing came from the stories told about him, who he had guided, what winters he had endured, what wisdom he had passed on. Now, in Elias Mercer's hand, was something else entirely. A likeness that did not fade with the teller's voice. Chief Tahoma took the photograph between his fingers, studying it in silence. His own gaze stared back at him from the glossy square. The wind returned, soft but certain, moving through the valley as if nothing had changed. But something had, because for the first time, authority was no longer carried only in memory, could be held, could be shown. And the man who knew how to make it appear had just stepped quietly into the center of their world. The photograph passed from hand to hand with a care usually reserved for sacred objects, each man holding it at arm's length first, then closer, as if distance might change what they were seeing. The younger warriors were the first to let curiosity show openly. They leaned in, shoulders brushing, their braids shifting in the wind as they studied the small square that now carried the chief's face with a stillness no mirror of water had ever held. An elder named White Elk remained seated near the central fire pit, his weathered hands resting on his knees. He did not reach for the image. He watched the men instead, measuring not the paper but the silence it created. In this valley, knowledge had always moved through breath. Stories were told beneath winter skies and repeated until they settled into bone. A boy learned who he was by hearing the names of those who came before him. A leader was not declared. He was remembered. Yet now, in the bright morning light, something new had entered the circle. The camera rested on the wool blanket where Elias had placed it, quiet and ordinary looking, its black casing absorbing the sun. It did not speak. It did not chant. It did not carry feathers or beads, but every eye returned to it. Noah Mercer stood a few feet behind his father, 12 years old and trying not to stare too hard. He had grown up watching faces appear from blank paper, had thought of it as nothing more than a marvel of chemistry and timing. Here it felt like more. One of the younger men stepped forward and gestured toward the camera, then toward himself. He wanted his likeness captured. Elias hesitated for only a second before nodding. He lifted the camera again, guiding the young man to stand near the shade line of a cottonwood tree. The shutter clicked. Another white square slid free. Again the waiting. Again the slow bloom of features rising from nothing. This time the reaction was different. A low sound moved through the group, not fear but something closer to recognition. The young warrior saw himself as others saw him, fixed and undeniable. He held the photograph against his chest for a moment before turning it outward, letting the others witness the proof of his presence. White Elk's gaze shifted from the boy to the elders beside him. He spoke softly in Apache, his words steady and deliberate. Elias did not understand the language, but he understood the weight of tone. It was the sound of something being considered, not rejected, not embraced, but measured. By midday, 5 portraits had been made. Each time the circle tightened. Each time the image passed through careful hands. And with each new square of glossy paper, the balance in the camp tilted a fraction of an inch. The young men stood taller. The children gathered closer to Noah, asking with their eyes if they might see their own faces next. The elders remained composed, yet their stories went untold that afternoon. No one asked for a tale of winter survival or of the long migration south. They were looking at something else now, something that did not require memory to endure. Elias felt it then, the shift so subtle it could almost be mistaken for wind. The power in this valley had always belonged to those who carried the past. Now, without raising his voice or demanding attention, he had introduced a tool that offered another way to exist. Not through repetition, not through lineage, but through a single captured moment that refused to fade. By late afternoon the light had turned amber, stretching long shadows across the valley floor and laying a quiet glow over the lodges. The photographs now rested in different hands, tucked carefully into leather pouches or held flat against chests as if warmth might seal them in place. The camp no longer felt exactly as it had at sunrise. It was not louder, it was not restless, but attention had shifted. Where once the center of gravity had been the elders seated near the fire pit, it now drifted toward the wool blanket where the camera waited. Noah noticed it first. The children did not gather around White Elk for a story as they usually did when the sun began to dip. Instead they formed a loose circle near him and his father, whispering and pointing toward the small black box. One little boy, no more than 6 years old, traced the edge of a photograph with a careful finger, then looked up at Noah with a question in his eyes that did not need words. "Can it do me too?" Elias knelt beside his case, wiping a thin layer of dust from the lens with a soft cloth. He told himself he was only recording what was already there. He was not choosing leaders. He was not offering rank. He was simply pressing a button. Yet each time the shutter clicked, the quiet that followed felt less like curiosity and more like expectation. A young woman approached, her posture steady, her expression calm. She did not ask directly. She stood in the open space where the light fell clean across her face. Elias understood. He lifted the camera again. The click sounded sharper in the evening air. When her portrait began to form, she did not step back in surprise as the others had that morning. She leaned closer, watching her own features rise from blankness, studying herself with a focus that bordered on wonder. Around her, several young men moved closer as well. They were not looking at her. They were looking at the photograph. White Elk finally stood. The movement drew a few glances, but not many. He walked slowly toward Chief Tahoma, who remained composed near the center of camp. The 2 elders spoke in low tones, their words steady and deliberate. Elias could not hear them, but he felt the shift in air pressure, like the moment before a change in weather. For generations, memory had required a witness. A story existed because someone carried it. Now a face could exist without retelling, could be passed along without breath. It could travel beyond the valley in a saddlebag and still remain unchanged. A boy who held his own likeness no longer depended entirely on an elder to affirm who he was. The image did that silently. Noah looked at the small stack of finished photographs resting beside his father and felt a flicker of something he had never known before. It was not pride. It was not fear. It was influence. The children asked him questions now instead of asking the storytellers. They watched his hands when he handled the camera, memorizing each motion. Elias sensed it too. The authority in the camp had not collapsed. It had tilted, just a few degrees. Enough that the next portrait might matter more than the last. Enough that the man who controlled the box now held more than a tool. He held a new way of being seen. The next morning arrived clear and windless, the kind of desert dawn where sound carried farther than it should. Elias woke before the sun cleared the ridge, hearing soft movement outside his canvas tent. When he stepped into the cool air, he found 3 young men already waiting, standing straight with the patience of those who believed something important was about to begin. They did not speak at first. They only looked at the camera case resting beside his saddle. Word had traveled through the camp during the night. Those who had been photographed held their images like quiet trophies. Those who had not felt the absence like an empty space in their hands. Elias understood the look. It was the same look he had seen in small towns when only one family could afford a portrait and the rest waited their turn. He poured water from his canteen, washing the dust from his hands, and opened the case slowly. The hinges made a soft metallic sound that drew more eyes. By the time the sun touched the tops of the cottonwood trees, a line had formed. It was not an ordered line, not in the way a railroad depot might arrange men waiting for tickets. It was looser, woven through with unspoken agreements, yet there was a clear sense of sequence. Each person wanted to step forward into the frame. Noah stood beside his father now, no longer lingering behind. He held the spare film packs carefully, aware that the stack was thinner than it had been yesterday. 30 exposures remained. That number carried weight. 30 faces. 30 moments chosen over others. A teenage boy asked if he could hold the photograph the moment it emerged. Elias nodded. The click of the shutter echoed lightly against the hills. The white square slid free, and the boy gripped it with both hands, watching as his own image surfaced. His expression changed in stages. First surprise, then approval, then something steadier, ownership. Nearby, 2 elders observed without stepping forward. White Elk's gaze was not fixed on the portraits now. It was fixed on the line. He noticed who stood near the front. He noticed who waited farther back. He noticed that the young men who had already been photographed walked with a different posture. Shoulders squared as if the paper in their pouches confirmed something that had once depended on reputation alone. Chief Tahoma moved quietly through the camp, speaking to a few families, listening more than he spoke. When he passed Elias, he paused only long enough to rest his hand briefly against his chest, a gesture of acknowledgement. It was neither approval nor resistance. It was recognition. By midday, the number of requests had doubled. Mothers lifted children so their faces would be seen clearly. 2 brothers debated who should stand closer to the center of the frame. The air held a current that had not existed before. Not tension, not conflict, but competition shaped by visibility. Elias felt the shift settle deeper. The portraits were no longer simple records. They were markers. To be photographed was to be affirmed in a way that required no witness afterward. And the authority to grant that affirmation rested quietly in his hands and increasingly in Noah's careful fingers as the boy began to press the shutter himself, learning the rhythm of selection, learning what it meant to decide who would be held still in paper and who would remain only in memory. By the 3rd day, the valley no longer moved at its old rhythm. The morning chores were still done, horses still watered, fires still tended, but attention bent toward a different center. The small stack of remaining film rested inside Elias Mercer's saddlebag. Lighter now, no more than 18 exposures left. 18 chances to decide who would be held in ink and gloss and who would remain carried only by voice. People had begun to notice the count. They did not ask directly how many were left, but their eyes drifted toward the leather pouch each time Elias reached for it. Noah felt the change more sharply than his father. Children followed him now, not in playful curiosity but in quiet calculation. They stood a little straighter when he looked their way. They tried to catch the light properly. One boy even adjusted the way he tied his braid before stepping near the cottonwood tree that had become the unofficial place of portraits. The camera had not grown larger, yet it felt heavier in Noah's hands. He understood something that had not been spoken aloud. To press the shutter was to choose, and to choose was to grant a kind of permanence. That afternoon, a young hunter who had not yet been photographed approached with deliberate steps. He had stood near the back of the loose line the day before, waiting without complaint. Now he looked at Elias, then at Noah, and asked in careful English if there would still be room for him. His voice did not carry urgency, but there was something beneath it, hope balanced against uncertainty. Elias hesitated, only for a breath, but it was enough. The pause was seen. The pause was felt. White Elk watched from across the clearing. He had begun telling shorter stories in the evenings, noticing that the listeners drifted away sooner than they once had. Children compared photographs instead of recounting tales of winter hunts. Young men asked each other who had been captured and who had not. The portraits had become tokens of recognition. They were shown during conversations, placed carefully beside sleeping mats, even studied in the reflection of firelight as if confirming the truth of one's own existence. Chief Tahoma gathered the elders near sunset. They did not raise their voices. They did not forbid the camera. They spoke about balance, about how memory lived not in paper but in people. Yet even as they spoke, a small group of youths lingered within sight of Elias's tent, waiting for morning, waiting for their turn. The shift was no longer subtle. Those who carried photographs were sought out more often. Their opinions were asked for. Their presence was acknowledged in a new way, not because the elders had lost wisdom, but because the image offered something different. Immediate proof, a visible claim. Noah lay awake that night listening to the low murmur of the camp and the soft rustle of wind against canvas. He thought about the remaining 18 exposures. Each one felt like a door that could only open once. And in that quiet desert darkness, he realized that scarcity had given the camera its true power. Not everyone could be seen. Not everyone could be fixed in that square of paper. And the ones who decided who would be held still were no longer only the elders who carried stories. It was the hands that held the box. On the fourth morning, the air felt tighter, though the sky remained wide and blue above the valley. Only 12 exposures remained. Elias counted them twice before sunrise, his thumb brushing the thin edges of each film pack as if they were coins in a gambler's palm. He did not announce the number, but numbers have a way of revealing themselves. By mid-morning, the camp moved with a quiet urgency. Those who had already been photographed stood with a subtle confidence, their portraits tucked safely into leather pouches. Those who had not lingered closer than before, watching Elias and Noah with careful eyes. Noah felt the weight of every glance. He had pressed the shutter 3 times the previous day, and each click had drawn more attention than his father's steady hands ever had. Children now looked to him first. A young woman asked him directly if he would be the one to take her portrait. The request was gentle, but it carried expectation. Noah looked at his father. Elias gave a small nod, neither encouraging nor refusing. The boy raised the camera. His hands did not tremble, but his breathing slowed as if he understood that this moment stretched beyond the frame. The click echoed. Another square of white slipped free. Around them, several young men leaned in, measuring not the image but the act. It was no longer only about being seen. It was about who granted the seeing. White Elk approached at last. He did not request a portrait. Instead, he stood beside Elias and watched the next image form. When the face appeared fully, he spoke quietly in Apache, his tone firm yet calm. The interpreter offered only a few words in English. He says that the picture shows what the eye sees, but it does not carry the story behind it. A few of the younger men exchanged glances. One answered softly, though not softly enough. The story fades. The picture stays. The words hung in the dry air like dust suspended in sunlight. No one raised a voice. No one stepped forward aggressively. Yet the fracture was visible now. Not in anger, but in alignment. The elders gathered near the central fire pit, while the youths drifted toward the cottonwood tree where the light was best for portraits. Chief Tahoma observed both groups without interrupting. He noticed that those who carried photographs were consulted first when a small disagreement arose over grazing routes. It was subtle. A glance. A nod toward the one whose face had been fixed on paper. Visibility had become influence. Elias felt the shift settle into his chest. He had not intended to alter the structure of the camp. He had come seeking light and composition. Yet scarcity had done what intention had not. With only a dozen images left, each decision now carried consequence. Noah sensed it too. When a younger boy pleaded quietly for his turn, Noah hesitated. He calculated. He chose another instead. The disappointment in the boy's eyes was brief, but it was real. In that instant, Noah understood something his father had not taught him. Authority does not announce itself. It accumulates in small permissions. The camera rested in his hands, silent and patient. And in the space between one click and the next, the balance of the valley leaned a little further toward those who controlled the frame. Only 7 exposures remained when the sun rose pale and thin over the ridge, and the number moved through the camp like a quiet rumor carried by breath rather than voice. Elias Mercer did not announce it, yet he felt the knowledge in the way people watched him unpack the camera from its leather case. The valley seemed to hold its sound lower than usual, as if even the wind understood that something finite was nearing its end. Noah stood beside his father, counting silently again, though he already knew the truth. 7 faces left to be fixed in paper. 7 decisions that could not be undone. By mid-morning, the space beneath the cottonwood tree filled with those who had not yet been chosen. They did not crowd. They arranged themselves with deliberate calm, each person aware that impatience might cost them the moment. White Elk remained seated near the central fire pit, speaking softly to 2 children who listened out of habit rather than urgency. Fewer gathered there now. The stories had not changed, yet their pull felt different in the shadow of scarcity. A young hunter stepped forward first, meeting Noah's eyes instead of Elias's. He did not plead. He simply stood in the light. Noah felt the weight of that gaze and lifted the camera. The click sounded louder than it had on the first day. The photograph slid free, blank and waiting. As the image formed, a small circle tightened around it. The hunter exhaled slowly when his likeness appeared, as though confirming something that had already been true but had not been proven until now. 6 remained. A murmur moved through the line. Not anger, not protest, calculation. 2 brothers exchanged a glance, silently negotiating who would step forward next. A mother adjusted her child's hair, then hesitated, sensing the thinning margin. Elias watched it unfold and felt a tightening in his chest. The camera had not raised its voice, yet it now directed the rhythm of the day. Chief Tahoma approached at last. The crowd parted without being asked. He did not move quickly. He did not signal urgency. He stood before Elias and Noah with the same steady presence he had carried since the first image had risen from white paper. He looked at the remaining film pack in Noah's hand, then at the line of those still waiting. When he spoke, his voice was low and even. The interpreter offered only a brief translation. He asks if the next picture can be taken in the council lodge. The request shifted the air. A portrait inside the place where decisions were made would not be simple visibility. It would be something else. Elias hesitated, then nodded. They moved toward the lodge together. Inside, the light filtered through the woven roof in soft beams, dust motes floating in quiet suspension. Chief Tahoma did not stand alone. He called White Elk to his side. The elder rose slowly and joined him without a word. Noah raised the camera, sensing that this image would carry more than a face. The click came, sharp and final in the stillness. As the photograph began to form, 2 generations emerged together on the small square of paper, side by side. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Not charged, Not fractured, simply aware. 5 exposures remained, but something had shifted beyond numbers. Authority was no longer drifting unnoticed. It was being acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement lay the first sign that the valley might yet decide for itself how this new power would settle. 5 exposures remained, and by late afternoon the number no longer hid itself behind silence. It rested openly in every glance, in every measured step toward Elias Mercer and his son. The portrait of Chief Tahoma and White Elk had shifted something deeper than curiosity. It had reminded the camp that an image could join generations instead of replacing one. Yet scarcity still pressed against the edges of the day. Noah carried the film pack in his palm as if it were fragile glass. He no longer looked only at faces. He looked at what stood behind them. A young mother approached first, holding the hand of a small girl who had not once stepped forward during the earlier days. The child had watched from behind her mother's skirts, eyes wide but quiet. Now she stood in the open, her chin lifted with a courage that felt older than her years. Noah felt the camp watching him. Not demanding, not pleading, waiting. He raised the camera and positioned the mother and daughter so the late sun brushed gently across their profiles. The click was soft, but the moment it created felt large. As the image formed, the child smiled at the paper version of herself, then looked up at her mother as if seeking confirmation that she was truly there. For exposures remained. The line shortened. Some stepped back voluntarily, sensing that others might carry more need than they did. That choice, quiet and unannounced, rippled through the clearing. It was the first sign that the valley was not surrendering to the frame but negotiating with it. Chief Tahoma watched this exchange with steady eyes. He moved through the camp again, speaking not of the camera but of balance, of how every tool serves the hand that guides it. Elias heard fragments through the interpreter and felt something settle inside him. He had arrived believing that visibility itself was power. Now he began to see that power rested in how visibility was given. A young hunter who had waited since the first morning stepped aside and gestured toward an elder who had not yet been photographed. The elder shook his head at first, then accepted with a nod that carried humility rather than reluctance. Noah captured the portrait carefully, framing not only the elder's face but the lines etched by years of desert wind and winter cold. When the photograph surfaced, several youths leaned closer, not out of novelty but respect. 3 exposures remained. The camp felt different now, less fractured than the day before. People spoke in lower tones. The earlier competition had softened into something steadier. Noah understood that the remaining frames were no longer prizes. They were responsibilities. He glanced at his father. Elias gave no instruction, only a look that said choose with care. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the valley in amber and long shadow, the camera rested between them like a quiet question. Not who deserves to be seen, but who should be remembered this way. And in that shift of question, the authority of the box grew lighter, not heavier, because the camp itself had begun to decide how it would live with the image rather than beneath it. 2 exposures remained when the sun lowered itself behind the western ridge, spilling copper light across the valley and stretching every shadow thin and long. The air felt quieter than it had all week, not with tension but with completion drawing near. Elias Mercer stood beside his saddle, the camera resting in his hands as if it had finally grown tired. Noah held the last film pack between his fingers, aware that what remained could not be replaced once it was gone. People no longer formed a line. They gathered in a wide circle instead, leaving an open space at the center as if the choice now belonged to everyone rather than to the box. Chief Tahoma stepped forward first. He did not position himself alone. He gestured gently, and from different parts of the circle came a hunter, the young mother with her daughter, White Elk, and 2 boys who had waited since the first morning without complaint. They stood together, not arranged by age or rank but by presence. Elias looked at Noah. The boy understood without words. This would not be a portrait of authority or of novelty. It would be a portrait of balance. Noah raised the camera slowly. The final light of day brushed the edges of their faces, soft and honest. The click sounded almost like a closing door. The white square slid into his hand. Everyone leaned in, not urgently but together. As the image began to form, the faces emerged side by side, none larger than the others, none hidden behind another. The elder's lined features, the hunter's steady gaze, the mother's quiet strength, the child's open curiosity, the boys who had waited. The photograph did not elevate one above the rest. It held them level. A murmur passed through the circle, low and thoughtful. One exposure remained. Noah looked down at it, then up at his father. Elias shook his head gently. He did not raise the camera. He closed the leather case instead. The final frame would stay unused. The choice not to take it felt heavier than any click had been. Chief Tahoma watched the gesture closely. He stepped forward and placed his hand over the closed case for a moment, then withdrew it with a small nod. No words were translated, yet the meaning was clear. The power of the image had not vanished. It had found its place. The elders resumed their stories that evening, and more children listened than the night before. Photographs were still held carefully, still studied in the glow of firelight. But they were no longer tokens of rank. They were reminders of moments chosen with care. At dawn the next morning, Elias and Noah packed their wagon. The valley did not feel altered beyond recognition. It felt steadier. As they rode away, Noah glanced back once and saw White Elk speaking to a small circle of youths, one of the photographs resting on the ground beside them. It was not the paper that held their attention. It was the voice. And for the first time since the first image rose from blankness, the camera in the saddlebag felt lighter than memory itself.